Jordan Peterson is a professor at the University of Toronto. He's written a lot about the decline of modern men. We spoke to him recently. Jordan Peterson, thanks for joining us. We've got a long list of statistics that paint a pretty clear picture that boys seem to be falling behind relative to girls in the United States. Why do you think that is?
I think that that's partly a consequence of directed policy. So it's linked to the idea that there's something wrong with masculinity, and so that the expression of masculinity should be limited in all sorts of arbitrary ways. The fact that kids can't really play at schools anymore is a manifestation of that. The fact that male behavior is often diagnosed as attention deficit disordered, for example, is a manifestation of that. The elimination of competition as a valid form of human interaction, and the failure to recognize that competitive sports, for example, are deeply cooperative in their fundamental nature, as long as everyone is playing by the rules, obviously. So there's that's a large part of it.
So you're saying that there is an organized, not always explicit, but still organized attempt to de-emphasize masculinity or to punish masculinity. Why? Because it's easy to mistake masculine competence for the tyranny that hypothetically drives the patriarchy. It's part of an ideological worldview that sees the entire history of mankind as the oppression of women by men, which is a dreadful way of looking at the world, a very pathological way of looking at the world. It's not like men and women always get along any more than men and men get along, or women and women for that matter. But fundamentally, human history is a cooperative enterprise, and men and women have lifted themselves out of the mire over millennia in their cooperative endeavor. And to describe that as centuries of the oppression of women by men is an absolutely reprehensible ideological rewrite of history. And it's what's taught in the humanities and in much of the social sciences at universities, and increasingly in the public education system. It's taken as an unassailable fact. And you're saying that this has bad consequences for the development of boys? Well, how could you feel good about that? I mean, if you're made out to be a potential manifestation of rape culture, if you're part of toxic masculinity, if your competitive drive is regarded as part of a tyrannical impulse, if the heritage to which you belong is regarded as an oppressive patriarchy, then how in the world are you going to step forward with confidence and shoulder that what would you call it, that burden? Why would you? Why wouldn't you just step aside and retreat, which is exactly what's happening? But if men are so aggressive and bent on domination, on establishing a patriarchy, why have they stepped back and allowed this to happen? Yeah, well, I guess that's a good question, isn't it? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they are precisely allowing it to happen. It's very insidious, the ideological movement that's driving this, part of the radical left. Part of the radical left, I would say, is it's a very insidious movement. It's not an easy thing to resist, and a lot of it occurs, well, for example, it occurs in the school system increasingly. And it isn't clear they're not men that are reacting to that, that's boys. It's not clear what they're supposed to do about it. So if you were to fight an ideological battle. It is hard. And finally, if you were to give parents of boys one piece of advice for how, in their small way, they can fight against this trend for the sake of their own boys, what would it be? Well, I would say, first of all, encourage them. And I mean that most deeply, is that to encourage someone is to instill courage in them, to support their courage. And that doesn't mean protect them from what's dangerous. It means teach them how to be competent and teach them that they can rely on themselves to prevail, even in the darkest of circumstances. That's part of it. Yes. I would say as well, more specifically, and this is specific advice for parents,
If you have your children in a school and they talk about equity, and there's a class and they talk about equity, diversity, inclusivity, white privilege, systemic racism, any of that, you take your children out of the class. They're not being educated, they're being indoctrinated. And there's absolutely no excuse for it.
I agree with that completely. You might run out of schools pretty quickly, though, here in this country.
That would be just fine. The sooner the better.
Jordan Peterson, it's hard to express my gratitude to you for telling the truth as you do. Thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.